Welcome everyone, I'm Michelle Schumann, the Artistic Director of the Austin Chamber Music Center. I'm here with Maureen Cross and we're doing Chamber Chat with Michelle and Mo, and we're here to talk about Chopinesque, our upcoming concert.
I'm really excited to talk about this particular concert because Chopin is one of those composers that's really well known to a lot of people. But what's interesting about him is that he did not write a lot of stuff for chamber music. So as we're closing out this season, I'm just curious why we're doing some Chopin to just kind of close out the season, because he is so well known, but not as a chamber composer.
Yeah, it's true, and Chopin is truly one of the most beloved composers. And when I tell people that I'm a pianist, usually they're like, "Oh, do you play Chopin? Chopin's my favorite." And so often people really associate, especially piano music, with Chopin, and it's true. I mean, almost everything that Chopin wrote was for solo piano, and he was such an incredible pianist himself, virtuosic, but just sort of had an intimate feel for the piano, and had such a unique voice for the piano. And yes, almost all of the music that he wrote was for solo piano. And it's interesting because at least he did write some chamber music, so that we have this wonderful music to be able to choose from. So it's so great. Of course, we couldn't have Chopin reoccurring on every chamber music program like we could for Brahms or Beethoven, because they wrote so much chamber music. But it's so nice to be able to come at it and kind of include that, and especially include it on a concert on its own, so you can display what is so great about Chopin, and then also kind of show this other side that people just aren't as aware of. So when people say that they love Chopin, a lot of times they haven't really heard his chamber music. And I think it's really interesting too, because the pieces that we're going to be performing, which is his piano trio, which is a very early work for him, and then the cello sonata, which is a very late work for him. And he didn't write any really thing for chamber music in between those times. So the piano trio, it's opus 8, and it was actually a student piece of his. He started writing it when he was 18 years old, and he was studying with a composer at a time. So it was almost an exercise of some sort. But what I think is amazing is that even though he was a wonderful pianist and he was clearly writing a lot of music for the piano, he felt the need immediately as a very young composer to write chamber music and to write a piece for a piano trio. And this is sort of similar in a way to Beethoven, whose first published works were for piano trio. So his opus 1 was a piano trio. So Chopin obviously had this sense that he wanted to write music for chamber music, but it actually ended up being quite a struggle for him, and he had to work very hard on this first piano trio. Again, even though he was writing copious amounts of piano pieces and already performing with orchestras and performing his pieces in public, he really struggled with this trio. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that I think writing for piano was so easy for him. And it just came so naturally to him, but he actually had to work hard at writing for string instruments and for the violin and cello. And so while it is really an incredible work and has that kind of youthful vibrancy, the piano really takes a lead in this too, and you can sort of see that that it was easier for him to write for the piano. So it's almost like a piano showpiece, and that the strings support the piano, almost like a piano concerto in a way. So it's kind of ironic in that way. And then later on, Chopin came to write the cello sonata, which again is a late work of his. So he took all that time off, but then obviously had this, this idea that I still really love chamber music, and I still really want to write for string instruments, especially. And so in that case, he wrote that, and actually, it also was a struggle for him.
Well, two things that kind of really stood out for me when I was looking at some back research on Chopin was that when you look at a lot of composers like Bach or Brahms, it's always about that they did a lot of work, that they wrote, regardless of what it was, that they had this massive,
prolific.
They were very prolific. Where Chopin is like the complete opposite.
Well, but he's very prolific when it comes to writing solo piano.
For the piano, right.
Right.
But I mean, for other stuff, it's like whether it was performance or like that. So I thought that was really unique in many ways with him. So kind of going back to that piano trio, this was another thing that I thought was really unique, was that I want to say I read something that was that was the only thing he ever wrote that included a violin.
That's right. That's
You know,
right. Well, and I think again it goes back to this, like, he just struggled a little bit with finding that voice. And actually at one point had said for the piano trio that he almost feels like he should have written it more for viola, cello, and piano, because he does stay in the lower registers of the violin for most of the trio. It never really gets up real high. You know, oftentimes when we think about violin, we think about these soaring lines and it's sort of going above the other voices, but not in this case. So I think that he had more of a feeling for the sound of the cello, and really loved those sort of deep and warm sounds. And even, you know, as a composer himself, so many of his melodies are like sort of in the middle, can be in the middle register of the piano, just sort of those singing kind of things. And you know, speaking of his love for cello, he even has some pieces, like there's an etude that is nicknamed the cello etude, because the melody is like in the left hand of the piano, and it's just this gorgeous melody in the middle texture of the piano where everything is sort of going around it. So I think it was just not an instrument that came naturally to him. And for a composer like Chopin, where things came naturally, right? He was such a virtuoso, such a child prodigy. And that can sometimes be the problem with if things come naturally to you, then you kind of stick to your guns with, like, I'm really good at this. And he was really good at piano music. And I think that that's another thing that's amazing about Chopin in a way, is that he didn't write symphonies, he didn't write string quartets, he didn't write all these other things that we know of from Beethoven and Mozart and all these major composers that everyone knows. And yet Chopin is like, you know, a top 3 composer.
Right. He's up there.
Yeah,
he's one of the big guys.
And yet his instrument was piano. It's just kind of amazing, and I think it's a reason to explore his other works in this way, and that's why we're really doing that.
And what's so cool is that he, you know, unlike a lot of the other composers, because they wrote, you know, across the board for instrumentation, because he so focused on piano, he really elevated this instrument to kind of a new height, you know, and really kind of plucked it.
Well, and composers often were pianists. You know, Mozart was an incredibly gifted pianist. Beethoven was a pianist. Bach was one of the world's, you know, greatest keyboardists of all time, the greatest improviser ever known to man, probably. And so it wasn't unusual for composers to be pianists. So piano repertoire has always been sort of elevated by these composers. But you're right, with Chopin it was a singular thing. Even with a composer like Franz Liszt, who is also known as one of the world's, you know, greatest pianists of all time, and definitely wrote a ton of piano music, but he also wrote pieces for orchestra and knew how to do that as well. So it's true that with this, you know, real singular mindset, Chopin created something new that no one had ever known of.
Yeah, it was just like a different tone. I mean, tone literally, but just a different paintbrush together that he kind of painted with, and it created a whole different, you know, sound.
Well, and maybe even the idea of, like, why didn't Chopin write more chamber music, or why is it not? It might have a lot to do with his style, even in writing for the piano. For one thing, most of his piano works that are kind of the most beloved, they tend to be miniatures. They tend to be short pieces of music rather than the long forms. And he certainly did write pieces in long form, but a lot of times they're not considered as successful as the miniatures. I don't know if I believe that. I'm just saying what other people say. I'm just telling you. I love the long forms, but that's often what he's noted for. Was that he was just a genius with these miniature forms, and he created so many new forms, like the nocturne and the mazurka and the polonaise, like these dance forms and these short pieces. And oftentimes the texture is a relatively simple texture. When we think about those forms, there's a melodic line and there's a beautiful but supportive, non-evasive harmony kind of supporting it in a way. And this all comes from the opera, operas that were being sung at the time, and this idea of bel canto singing. So you had these beautiful sopranos who would sing these lovely lines, and the orchestra would go boom, be dee, boom, be dee. Very simple, and those were the textures, and this is what Chopin knew, and Chopin knew these textures, and he tried to bring that to piano writing, and it works incredibly well with piano writing. And even though for instance, the left-hand textures are oftentimes quite simple, he brings a sophistication to it. So it's not, there's something very artistic and ingenious about that too, but then oftentimes the melodic lines will just go all over the place and be florid and be free. But then again, the accompanying lines don't have that much to do. So I think he probably struggled with that with chamber music, because he wanted to still have those long, florid, beautiful, overreaching, overarching melodic lines, but he didn't want his string players to just be going like, you know, the cello being like gonk, gonk. So he really works hard to have that be integrated, and I think it wasn't something that came totally natural to him. But in the pieces that we're doing, because he worked so hard at it, they end up being incredibly successful pieces, especially the cello sonata, which was late in his life. And so by that time he had so much experience in writing for piano and just in hearing music around him that he knew how to kind of conquer those difficulties. And in that piece, the piano and cello have very equal roles, almost too equal. He cannot let the pianist take center stage or take backstage ever. So it is definitely, it's such a piano piece, but then the cello is like fighting for that, you know, to be a part of that at all times. So you have this very equal sounding piece, and it's dramatic and amazing. What's cool about these two pieces of chamber music too is that they're both in G minor. So somehow it's almost the feeling that whatever Chopin started early on in his life when he was 18 years old with the piano trio, it's almost like he wanted to learn from that, and he takes at least the key from that, and definitely the idea of the sort of torpor of G minor, which is generally this sort of just kind of a dark key, dramatic key for sure. And then he brings that into the cello sonata. And just to kind of tie things in a little bit more, Clara Schumann, who we played her piano trio in November, her piano trio is in G minor. And we talked a lot about that. That was her only piano trio, and it's such a marvelous work, and it has this drama. I think there are major correlations between these works.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So just thinking about you know, maybe some of his motivations behind some of the works that he was writing. You know, I also think about Chopin as being, you know, like one of those composers that you always identify with romance, and you know, as being one of the most romantic composers of all times. Like, you know, that's kind of his identity.
Like K-Tel brings you Romance by Chopin.
Exactly. And the first piece that's on the program, the Barcarolle, am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Let me make sure I'm saying that right. I thought it was cool that literally translates into boat songs, which apparently were songs that the gondoliers would sing up and down the canals, right? And these kind of little love songs that they. So I thought, oh well, that's you know, like so precious and so, you know, sweet. And this was the only one that he wrote of that kind of piece, but he wrote it at a time in his life that was very not lovely and very sad, and it was kind of towards the end of his life. He was very ill, and he and his longtime love, George Sand, were no longer together, and so I often find it really interesting when a composer, whether it's a classical composer or a modern day composer, writes such a beautiful love ballad, love song, whatever, from such a dark place.
Well, I think one thing that we have to understand, and I always try to find these connections too between what's going on in a composer's life personally and the music that they're writing. But I think one thing that we have to understand too is that almost always when something bad is happening, usually there's something good happening too. And really, and at that time, and that's not to dispute that, you know, we'll address the roughness too. But also at that time that he had broken up with George Sand. Of course, this is one of the romantic pairings of all time. You know, she was this incredible woman, a woman way ahead of her time. You know, just a writer and a force of nature, and she wanted to be called by a man's name because she didn't want people to know that she was a woman, because she wanted to have a career. And she was, again, like sort of like Clara Schumann, just doing whatever she needed to do. Woman. And they were deeply in love and had an incredible relationship. And when they broke up, actually, and they had a daughter together, it was around the same time that his daughter was getting married. So at the same time that he was going through this terrible, desperate time was at a time of where his daughter was falling in love. So we can sort of bring that into the situation too, and sort of imagine that this is almost like an ode to her of the kind of combining of these forces too. And the barcarolle, but even if we go back to the idea that it was a torturous time for him, a deeply, how do composers write incredibly beautiful, poignant, wonderful music when they're so distraught? I think that's the power of music. That sometimes is the gesture to get you out of the depression, is to use music to elevate yourself and elevate everything and everyone around you. And truly, the barcarolle is one of the most beautiful. I mean, there's so many beautiful pieces to choose from with Chopin. Like, there's just so many. But the barcarolle, it's on this level. When the level is already so high, it reaches even up higher than that. And for me, it's a personal piece for me. It's actually a new piece for me, but it was a piece that I started learning when my daughter was born. And actually, I started learning it when she was in my belly, because I had a list of repertoire that I wanted to play basically to her before she was born. And certainly I haven't, because I had a baby, I haven't been able to work on it straight through, but I keep coming back to this piece. And so for me, it has a really incredible place in my heart, because I just think that it's one of the all-time most beautiful pieces of music ever written. I mean, it has drama, but it has such beauty. And you had mentioned love song, and I think that has a real place and has a real feel to it. It is a Venetian boat song called the Barcarolle, and Mendelssohn wrote several Venetian boat songs. He called them Venetian gondolier songs. And going back to opera during that time, it was very popular to include a barcarolle in the opera. And the barcarolle that is so famous that we know, which was probably after Chopin's time, is the Offenbach barcarolle from Tales from Hoffmann. You know it. I know you know it, and I know all of you know it. You should Google it. And Barcarolle Offenbach, and you'll see that it's so famous. It's in virtually every car commercial that ever existed. Anyway, very beautiful, and it's for two singers and two female singers. So you have their lines, and it produces such a sweet sound because they move in thirds with each other or in sixths, and those are very sweet intervals. And this barcarolle does the same thing. The melodic line is basically two lines that move together at the same time. So we have this idea almost like a union of voices. So it's not just one beautiful melody, but it's two melodies that move in succession with each other. So like a duet of sorts. So even though this is a solo piano piece that I'm playing on this program, it really functions like chamber music because we hear those voices, and as they move together and sometimes move in different directions, but creating this incredibly beautiful counterpoint. I mean, it's just one of the all-time best Chopin pieces. So to put it on this program, I just couldn't resist.
That's gorgeous. That's really pretty. And I didn't know you had a daughter.
Yeah.
I didn't really know. I thought.
Well, because they didn't marry. Georges
Right.
Sand and Chopin didn't marry, but.
But they had such a modern relationship.
Right.
Especially.
Shacking up.
I know, shacking up, having babies out of wedlock. Gosh.
Yeah.
Well, they were all Kimye way before Kimye, right? And that does speak to the power of music, because I mean, for me, I couldn't imagine being able to produce something like that when going through such a difficult time. I just would want to eat bonbons and watch movies,
Well, and this is what great art does, not only for the people who are creating it, but for the people who get to experience it. So to be able to go to music either in a creative vein or even just in a listening vein, I mean, there's a reason why we use music to celebrate things and why we use music to mourn things. And not to put this on a morbid note, but when there are funerals, oftentimes the most powerful time in a service is the music that is being played, especially if it was chosen for the person or chosen by the person, and there's just something incredibly powerful about that. And again, we use music to celebrate too, and for me, this barcarolle is about celebrating the life of my baby, which I think is really just a sweet thing. But even when we celebrate birthdays, we sing happy birthday, and it's a really, really important part of our celebration.
Sure, absolutely.
And so we use music, whether that's light fare or whether that's deep, profound music, to really explore what is great about living as a human being, and the emotion that we can project. And I think that that's all about the Romantic period, is the idea that we have emotions and that we can dig into our emotions and that we can express our emotions to the fullest, maybe even fuller than we can in real life, through music. And music gives us that avenue to experience being a human being at the deepest level.
And I think really that's what this concert is going to be all about, that celebration, not just of Chopin and his music, but the celebration of the power of music. And I think that's really what the season, in a lot of ways, has been.
It's been an emotional roller coaster,
Right.
hasn't it?
We've been under the influence of all kinds of emotions this season, and we hope you'll join us to hear this all Chopin program and hear these wonderful musicians perform this great, wonderful music. We'll see you at the concert.
Yes, see you soon.